Hi, Facebook. Hi, world. Hi, YouTube, when we get there. We're talking today with Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. He's a professor, well, now at Stanford University in international relations, and he is all over the American media and very present in Russian life as well through Twitter and more. He's taken on a very public role in talking with Americans and the world about Vladimir Putin, about the years of Donald Trump and Trump's posture toward Putin, about where Russia stands in, not Russians necessarily, but Russia led by Putin in taking on the US-led international order right now and for some time now. He's written recently that Putin is at war with the United States. He joins us today from California. We're really glad to have him. Let me bring him right on in. Hello, Michael. Are you there, my friend? Michael, welcome. We're on.
Hey, Tom, how are you?
Hi, very well. Thanks a lot for being here, Michael.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you loud and clear. We all do. First of all, thank you for the very public role you've taken on in recent years in talking about this crazy world of ours. What's that felt like? You were an ambassador, which is a public role, but now you're a social media phenomenon as too, and all over broadcast media. What led you to step out of the, or maybe you never were inside the professorial cocoon, but what led you to become so public in these recent years, Michael?
Well, that's a good question. You know, Tom, I've been a professor at Stanford since 1995. I teach courses on Russia, is what most people know me for, but I haven't actually taught a course on Russia for about 15 years. I normally teach courses on democracy, democratic change, democratic erosion, social movements, American foreign policy. And when I got back from Russia, I kind of settled into a rhythm. I think of my job as a portfolio of things I do. I teach, I write, I interact with the public, sometimes in, just like we're doing right now, sometimes in guest lectures, sometimes on NBC, my Washington Post column. But I think what really compelled me was the Trump era, and feeling, as I wrote in a column January, 2 weeks after the inauguration, that we were experiencing things here in our country that I had observed and written about in other countries in the world, Russia in particular, but not only. And I just decided, you know, I just can't sit on the sidelines and talk to my fellow academic colleagues and just have that as what I do. I have to be more public and vocal and on multiple platforms, right? So to think about reaching bigger audiences in different places. And I want to be honest with you, Tom, it hasn't always been comfortable for me. I try to be polite, engaging with arguments. For me, data, evidence matters a lot. So, but I just thought at this moment in our history, I had to be more engaged. So that's what motivated me.
We're glad you are. Your voice is very important in the chorus out there. Let's jump right into it. There's so much to talk about with Russia, and it's so on fire these days. You've written recently, but stepping back from data and evidence, you've written recently that Vladimir Putin is at war with the United States. Who's winning? Looks to me like he is and has been for some time.
Well, he's had some tactical victories on the battlefield, to stretch the metaphor, in that, you know, to back up a little bit, you know, 20 years ago, or especially 30 years ago, when I first met Vladimir Putin, that was not his worldview. I want to underscore that. He has changed with time. And as a result of you know, consolidating autocracy at home and his view about us, he's changed. So where he does see us as trying to overthrow his regime, and he thinks about the liberal international order as something created by us. By the way, he's right about that after World War II. Mm-hmm. He thinks it's a way for us to extend our hegemony around the world. I think it's a way for us to create win-win outcomes with other countries, but that's the evolution in his thinking. So if 20 years ago he wanted to join that club and things like the G8 and WTO, today he sees that as antithetical to his definition of Russian national interests. Not everybody's definition of national interest inside Russia, but his. And I do think you have to, you know, if you add it all up, he has scored some victories. And in particular, I would say the one place that we don't focus enough attention to is the ideological dimension of Putin and Putinism. His worldview is there's the decadent liberal West. It supports American imperial intentions. I, Vladimir Putin, am the last great conservative leader left in the world combating that, restoring, Russian values, Orthodox values, standing up for sovereignty against this outside world. And he's invested in that, Tom. He's invested in RT, Russia Today, to propagate those ideas. Sputnik, Sputnik radio channels are all over the world these days. I don't think most Americans know that, but you're in the Balkans and you're looking for a radio station, you're more likely to find a Russian one than the BBC these days. And NGOs and, forums and even sometimes directly financial support for political parties in France. Marie Le Pen, they've given her money. And as a result of that, there is what I would describe as a transnational illiberal international. That is a set of forces that lean more towards Putin's worldview than liberal internationalism. And Viktor Orban in Hungary, he's more friendly with Putin than he is with Joe Biden, President Biden. But all throughout Europe, you can find every single country in Europe has a party today that is more in line with Putin's worldview than ours. And when I say that ours, I need to be careful there. Actually, there is no our view anymore in America. There's actually quite a few Americans, millions of Americans, that would line up more ideologically with Putinism than classic liberalism. And I want to underscore, when I use the word liberal, it's a small L that I'm talking about. It's not liberal conservative. It's liberalism that started with the Enlightenment 300 years ago and helped markets and democracy flourish over the last 200 or 300 years. That is the ideological clash that is going on. And yes, I think Putin has scored some victories in the short term.
So did Trump line up with Putinism? Has the Republican Party today lined up with Putinism, Michael McFaul? And by the way, listeners, we're so glad you're here. Give us your questions. Bang them right in here online on Facebook. We're live at the moment. We'll be on YouTube soon. If you've got questions for Michael McFaul, the great Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, let us hear them right now. But what about it, Michael? Trump, the GOP, is this Putinism on American soil?
First, Tom, I just have to laugh. I'm looking at you physically. I've listened to your voice for so many decades, usually in my car, and it's just so pleasant to see you. Sorry for that.
You too.
Orthogonal comment. Yes and no, in a couple of respects. Obviously, President Trump wanted to be Putin's friend. He made that very clear. It's one of the things he was consistent on for 4 years. And on certain kinds of issues, yes, there was an ideological overlap between Trumpism and Putinism. Having said that, Trump, I don't want to overstate the ideological coherency of Trumpism. That I think is a mistake that we sometimes make, that he has a clear worldview. I don't think he does. I think he kind of bounces, or he did bounce around quite a bit. Having said that, there were definitely elements of overlap. The internationalists, the globalists are out to get us, and we need to return to, populist nationalist themes. There was an overlap there. And most certainly elements of the Republican Party, not the entire Republican Party, but elements definitely overlap with Putinism. In fact, sometimes they interact. Russian ideologues appear on InfoWars and different, kind of.
Alex Jones. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Alex Jones and Alexander Dugin, very famously, were on a show, got a lot of play in Russia, where the two of them are talking, and they ideologically line up pretty closely. Same with Steve Bannon, by the way, who also sees himself as this anti-globalist, actor. And there are ideological overlaps with elements of the Republican Party, but I wouldn't argue with the entire Republican Party.
I mean, the news out today from The Guardian is a new report from a former KGB agent saying that Donald Trump has been a Russian asset, intelligence asset, for more than 40 years. That ever since his first visits to the then Soviet Union, I guess, yeah, I guess it still was, they've seen him as vulnerable, as usable, as malleable, and that he has parroted a kind of Russian intelligence line, destructive to Western alliance, over most of that time. Is this news to you, or has this been obvious to you? How do you take that on board? This is a headline just out, big story out today, Michael.
Yeah, I saw it. And you know, I tread very lightly when people use the word asset and, you know, officer for another foreign government, when I haven't seen the classified information to support those kinds of contentions. And so I'm not gonna, I can't confirm or deny that. I don't know. What I do know, and what I have observed very closely for many years now, is there's no question in my mind that many elements of Trump's foreign policy, but especially national policy, domestic policy, served Putin's interests. When we are fighting amongst ourselves in these polarized ways, that means we're not engaging in the outside world. That is bad for American national interests, and that is good for Putin. When the president inspires people to storm the Capitol building in one of the most shocking, horrific days that I can remember ever in my lifetime about American democracy.
January 6th.
January 6th. That event, that photo is handing on a silver platter a gift to Vladimir Putin, because, and it will give for years and decades to come for the Putin folks, because forevermore they'll say there's no democracy in America. Look at you guys, you know, you're no different than us. You know, anybody who looks at my Twitter feed, you can see it every night, flooded with Russian trolls saying exactly that. So when we're those kinds of things, in my view, helped President Putin in achieving his objectives, and I think hurt America in achieving our objectives.
So what about the notion that he was a more active asset than that? It's more than a notion. I mean, it obsessed Congress, Democrats, maybe critical Republicans for much of the Trump presidency. It led to, you know, the whole huge investigation and Trump's perpetual cry of Russia hoax. Active support of Trump and his election bid in 2016, circumstantial support throughout his presidency. Do you see that, Michael?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and let's break it down a little bit. First, did Putin back in 2016 want Trump to win and Clinton to lose? That's clear as day. You don't have to believe me. Putin himself has said it. He said it very dramatically in Helsinki in 2018 when they were meeting together. Я хотел, что он выиграл, for those that speak Russian. That's what he said. I wanted him to win. Clear as day. Number two, did he try to help him win? Yes, unequivocally. The evidence for that is overwhelming. When you steal data, steal American property, and then publicize that property in a way to discredit Clinton and help Trump, that's just obvious. You don't need to look at social media. That was a clear operation designed to hurt Secretary Clinton and help Trump. And then add to that the social media echo effect. Now, remember, you can't echo something if it's not there first, right? Mm-hmm. They were amplifying divisions within our society. And here at Stanford, by the way, I have colleagues who are studying these things and looking at it closely. They amplified, you know, all kinds of divisions, especially racial divisions, just so you know, as we dig deeper into it, because they saw that as a place that they could amplify division. And then, you know, concoct demonstrations. Literally, Russians sitting in Moscow organized demonstrations in our country in 2016. That is clear as day. Third, did it have a causal influence on the outcome in 2016? That's harder to say, because there's so many elements that led to Trump's victory and Clinton's loss that to isolate the independent influence of the Russian effect, that's a hard social science problem, and I would say the evidence for that is inconclusive. But most certainly that was the attempt. And then finally, to your point, did they continue that through right through to the 2020 election? Absolutely, in my view, including the stuff on Ukraine, including, propagating these myths about what Vice President, now President Biden, was doing in Ukraine. A lot of the source material for that came from Russia and came from people that were identified as operatives for Russian intelligence. And I want to be clear, they were identified by the Trump administration's own government, not by me, Mike McFaul. It's his own government that said that, not me.
So I want to stay with where Putin stands in his battle with the West. It seems to me that he's made amazing progress. It seems to me that he's put the liberal democratic project in danger, in peril. Now, maybe not alone. Maybe there are other circumstances that you like to look at. But when you look globally, I mean, you ticked off a few of them, places where anti-democratic, undemocratic leaders have taken over within the putative West, and the Republican Party now looking to defy the democratic outcome of an American election, to deify a single man, kind of in the way that Putin is often, maybe deified is too far, but maybe not in Russia. I mean, how successful has his project been? How much is the liberal democratic world on the back heel, as the Brits would say, right now, Michael?
I think it's a pretty dark time. If you go back to 1991 and the height of liberalism and democracy and ideological homogeneity, and we were the only world superpower. My colleague here, Frank Fukuyama, wrote that famous essay, End of History. By the way, everybody should read that essay in the book. It actually, I think, was seeing some things. And by the way, the arc of history is long. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. This drama is not over. We're just, we're in the second or third quarter of it, not the end game. But fast forward to today, there are many different trends going on that I think have eroded support for liberalism and democracy in the world. So number one is our internal battles, right? When we're fighting and we're undermining our own democracy. And by the way, most scholars and independent organizations that measure democratic trends, there's a lot of consensus that America is less democratic today than we were 4 years ago. But it even predates Trump, by the way. That erosion started before Trump. So that's the first thing. If we're in decline, that's bad for liberalism and democracy around the world. In fact, we're in the 14th year, according to Freedom House, of a democratic recession around the world, where more countries are becoming less democratic than countries are becoming democratic. Then number two, you add Russia and China to that mix, where Russia is become an autocracy. Tragically, it wasn't that way 20 years ago. And now Putin has his form of an alternative vision that's anti-liberal. But then the rise of China also. And the Chinese are offering an alternative worldview that is different from liberal democracy. And that, I think, affects the mix. And then in the middle, as you were hinting at, you have a lot of erosion, not just in peripheral, well, you have a lot of erosion around the world, I would say. I mentioned that. But especially in Europe, I worry about it. Places like Hungary, even Poland, places where we thought liberalism and democracy had consolidated after 1989. It turns out that there's still more churn taking place there. And then add to that, the last dimension I wanted to say, beyond Europe, Turkey, Brazil, India. People don't like to talk about India, but we should. Even South Korea. There are a lot of places where democracy is not as strong today as it was 10 or 20 years ago. And there are the rise of these strongman populists. So I think it's a pretty difficult time. Now, I'm an optimist, Tom. Democracies are a horrible system of government, like Churchill said, but better than all the rest. And the one great thing that we have with democratic institutions that autocracies do not have is we have the possibility for renewal. We have the possibility for correction. It doesn't mean we always do it, but we have that there. And I actually think the last election here in the United States was a moment of democratic renewal. And I'm not saying that in a partisan way about Democrats and Republicans. I'm saying the event in and of itself. And it was horrible. And again, January 6th was this horrible event, but we got out of it with the American people saying, we don't like this trajectory we're on. And I see the possibility of democratic renewal, small d democratic renewal, that we get back to everybody agreeing that, no, this is dangerous. We got really close here. We need to go back to some basic, consensus about the basic rules of the game of democracy.
But let's keep it real, Michael. I mean, you've seen the number in the US Congress of Republicans who have decided not to hold President Trump so far to account for the steps he's taken, who have embraced the big lie that he won and that Biden's election was a fraud. I mean, this is going right on. And the loyalty test, there's Kevin McCarthy at Mar-a-Lago with Trump now, sort of embracing him, even after that defeat, which many Republicans are not conceding. It seems like an embrace of something like Putinism. I'm not sure if you would describe it that way. We've got listeners asking, is Putinism fascism? What is Putinism?
Well, those are lots of big questions there. I have compared Putin and Trump, by the way, in various publications, and there are parallels. And this cult of personality in particular bothers me a lot as an American, small d Democrat, small l liberal. I wrote about it after their convention in particular, where I just saw lots of elements of cult of personality that are very familiar to me, thinking about Putin and other autocracies over the history, right? So that is there. And
you've seen this video today that's come out at some Russian corporation, I guess, an online shopping company, it turns out, with hundreds or thousands, I don't know, but people dressed all alike, sort of doing a big coordinated dance. And, for Putin looks like a scene out of a North Korean, party day parade.
Yeah, I did see it. It's deeply disturbing. And I see elements of that kind of way that people talk about President Trump, Mr. Trump. And I would also say, Tom, this is not unique to American history. During times of dislocation, as we're going through with globalization and people being left out, in other countries, you've seen it, where more radical elements align with more, moderate elements. And sometimes groups do deals to advance kind of common objectives, and then they learn to live with those consequences. And sometimes that can end very poorly, right?
You're talking about conservative, traditional Republicans doing deals with the more Trumpist, cult of personality Republicans. And now a lot of those more business-oriented traditional conservatives are on the outside looking in practically.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And I saw it, the column I mentioned earlier that I wrote back in January of 2017, I explained that's exactly what happened in Russia. Putin came along. He looked like he had these autocratic tendencies, but big business went along with him. You know why? Because he cut their taxes. That's the first thing he did. He cut corporate taxes. I hope it sounds familiar. That's exactly what they did. And then he rolled back media freedom, and they're like, oh, let's just go along. This is not so bad. The economy was growing, and they just kind of went along. And we know how that story ends. They went along for too long until they did not have the power to check Putin's power. And I think that is an important lesson, particularly inside the Republican Party. I'm more confident about the strength of American democratic institutions as a whole, right? They're stronger than they were in Russia in 2000 by orders of magnitude. Our courts, our civil society, our media, people like you. I mean, that is strong and vigorous. And I have been, it rose up. I mean, for lack of a better word, it was tested, and those institutions pushed back.
Narrowly won, though. Narrowly won.
Narrowly.
A few tens of thousands of votes in a few states, and it would still be President Trump today.
Correct. And I agree with that. Very scary. And that's why I don't like the flirtation that you see. I mean, codified, in that photo with Mr. McCarthy down meeting with President Trump. I know a lot of these Republicans, Tom. I interact with them behind closed doors. I know what they really think of Trump. I think if you did a quiet, anonymous poll of the members of Congress and the members of Senate, I think you'd find very, very shallow support for Trump and Trumpism. But they're afraid to say that publicly because they worry about, their elections, and they worry about how to keep him within the party. My own, it's not for me to judge, but from a history, I would say, be careful, because playing that inside game, let's all just get along, let's work with this guy, that can be the end of you. And I think they should use this moment to resurrect the Republican Party. I mean, I think American democracy needs a strong right of center party that believes in democratic rules of the game. I think that's good for our democracy. And flirting with openly anti-democratic ideas and openly factual ideas, I mean, I live and work at a university where, facts and evidence is everything. And yet I see people playing with things that I know they know better. Senator Hawley knew better. He knew that he was playing with fire. He knew that you cannot legislate the overturning of the Electoral College. I mean, come on. There's no way that he didn't know that that was right, but he decided for political purposes to play along with that. And I think that's really dangerous. And I hope they have a much more vigorous fight within their party. I was cautiously optimistic a few weeks ago. I'm a little less optimistic today about that.
Well, the last couple of weeks have seen a lining up behind Trump, and Trump, who has stood next to Vladimir Putin very comfortably over time. I mean, it's really remarkable how the United States, when Russia, the Soviet Union, was communist, socialist, went after it hammer and tongs, and its influence everywhere, and its very seat of power at home. But when it becomes Putin-esque, or Putinism, conservatism, anti-democratic, oligarchic, and now we have a major party which is a whole lot less troubled by that and seems to be modeling on that. How do you explain that, Michael?
Well, I think it's a global response, right? So you see populist nationalists pretending to be conservative orthodox. Notice I added an adjective there, right? Because the notion that Putin is a Christian Orthodox or that Trump is some leader of the religious conservative movement is rather paradoxical to me. Let me put it diplomatically, okay? But they lash onto that, and they identify with that. Most certainly Putin does, and most certainly Trump has. And you see it around the world. It's a reaction to globalism, and I understand that. The particular affinity between Trump and Putin is something, however, unique. I mean, I'm thinking about other leaders. I probably maybe Viktor Orban in Hungary is the only other leader in the world that had the same affinities to Putin personally, more so than President Trump. And I'm just disappointed, to your point about the Republican Party. I just, I work at the Hoover Institution, by the way, as well here at Stanford. It's considered a conservative think tank. And, the slogan of the Hoover Institution is ideas defining a free society, or something like that. And, some of these ideas are not part of a free society. And I'm hopeful that there'll be a bigger, deeper fight over, not about, what should be the tax rate in America. That's a policy debate between liberals and conservatives. That's not the axis I'm talking about. I'm talking about the axis between autocrats and Democrats. And I've seen the survey data. The vast majority of Americans believe in democracy. We need to be careful not to look at those photos of the Capitol on January 6th and say, well, they speak for, because 70 million plus voters supported Trump, that they supported that action. They do not. Public opinion polls show that. and I can speak from my own personal experience with my own family and friends. I'm from Montana. I have lots of people, I know lots of Trump supporters that did not support those anti-democratic actions, but now they need leadership in the party to, excise those autocrats and say, we're not going to be a part of that. That's where we need real leadership within the Republican Party.
Michael, I want to just keeping it real at the same time. I hear you about many Republicans. On the other hand, that's not the way it's going right now. They're still lining up with Trump and against those who have called out his anti-democratic actions. That is a fact. That is happening. I mean, I think sometimes we need to step way back. You describe Putin with his anti-democratic impulses. China, clearly anti-democratic. I mean, just look at tiny Hong Kong, couldn't tolerate that, let alone inside the party. Look at Tiananmen. But China's a huge power now. And you remind us in your recent writing that Russia is no longer the weak, stumbling, has-been power that it was in the 1990s.
Right.
If the United States and Western liberalism doesn't stand strong, if Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China succeed in shaping the world in their image, in the way they'd like to see it, what would it look like? I think people just presume that democracy goes on strong perpetually because that's been the American story pretty much for the last century or so. If it weren't that way, if the world got bent toward the Putin path, the China path, what might that look like, Michael? You're one of the people who's in a position to describe that for us.
Be a very nasty world, and that we would revert back to the norm of most of human history, Tom. One of my colleagues,
people have forgotten it.
Well, first let me recommend a book by a colleague of mine, a friend of mine. His name's Robert Kagan, and his book is called The Jungle Grows Back. And it's about exactly what we're talking about. He said, just like you just said, Tom, we've all grown accustomed to think democracy's here forever. And, we've lived in a relatively peaceful world for the last 30 or 40 years, right? But if you look at most of human history, it was the jungle, right? The Hobbesian jungle where nobody was in charge, where there was anarchy, where there was war. War was the modal state, where we were fighting wars for 30 years, in Europe. We were always at war. People were always dying. Countries were always invading each other. When I teach about this, I show a video of 1,000 years of European history that just shows the borders moving. And people are shocked when they see this because they've forgotten that that's the way it used to be. And two things happened after World War II. I mean, we were in that until up to World War II. We emerged from that as one of two superpowers that anchored the liberal world. And then the Soviet Union collapsed. And then we really anchored what became a global world, right? But that had to do with American leadership and American power. And if we do not have the same power and leadership, I think it's very, I don't want to say it's probable, but we could easily return to that kind of world. Only remember that, the weapons that we have today are much more lethal than the weapons we had 300 years ago when we were fighting those 30-year wars in Europe, or even World War I or World War II. It's a pretty nasty world.
I mean, the United States has been in a number of wars since World War II. So you'd have to say it's not as though war vanished during this time of the US-led liberal order. On the other hand, it hasn't been just might makes right. And there have been some ideals floating through there.
Yes.
At the same time and often acted on. But the notion of what happens to the little guy, of course, what happens to the little guy in this country has been pretty disconcerting in a lot of ways in recent decades. But in Russia, it looks like an oligarchy from the outside, not just an autocracy, but an oligarchic autocracy. Now, under Trump, people thought, well, maybe that's what the United States will be as well. I mean, look past the war at the sort of texture of life and political life in a world dominated by a Xi Jinping China, a Vladimir Putin Russia. Those views.
Well, that means the little guy loses out for sure. Autocracies sometimes grow and sometimes redistribute wealth, but oftentimes they don't. And there's been a correlation of that for 2,000 years, that democracies are more egalitarian societies, and egalitarian societies are better at supporting democracies, whereas oligarchies tend towards democracies, right? And that is a nasty world where the little guy, or let's call them citizens, do not have a voice in what happens in their countries. That said, I also, you pointed out something we need to also, I don't know how this story goes, but on the other side of the ledger, let's be clear about some good news too. Some good news is that there are more democracies in the world today than at any, aside from the 14-year recession we're in. If you go back for 2,000 years, this is the height of democracy, right? We haven't had this many democratic countries in the world ever. Number two, if you look at opinion poll surveys, and Pew does a good job of this, it turns out that the kind of system of government that there's most demand for in the world today is still democracy. People don't want a one-party communist country like Xi Jinping. They don't want a theocracy like Iran. And with a very rare exception, they don't want a personalistic autocratic ruler like they have in Russia. And that gives us something to work with. And then number three, and this is the work of the Biden administration right now, but there are such a thing, my old boss, President Obama, used to use this phrase all the time, called win-win outcomes. Instead of that Hobbesian world where it's just the mightiest that wins, it's like, no, we can cooperate even with countries that are pretty different from us and achieve things that are good for them and are good for us. And that's what, international institutions are supposed to do, organizations, treaties. And, I'm still cautiously optimistic that there is some more positive work to be done on that front as well.
I want to look at that. But if you were Vladimir Putin right now, wouldn't you be thinking about going for the kill on liberal democracy rather than going for the win-win? I mean, he must see that things have really sort of fainted into his lap in a way that he could surely hardly have ever anticipated 20 years ago. I mean, could he have imagined this degree of chaos and disillusion of democracy in the United States, the seat of democracy? Wouldn't you go for it?
That's interesting. Well, he is. I mean, in a way, he is. I mean, let's remember how belligerent, and I would say illegal, and I would even say criminal and rogue he's become. Right. So back when he first became president, he was brand new, accidental president. There was no demand for him politically, too, by the way. That's a giant myth that he wants the world to think. He was chosen by Yeltsin. And back then, he was pretty constrained and moderate. 20 years later, and I really think 2014 was this pivotal moment when one of his allies in Ukraine fell, Yanukovych. He blamed us for that. He blamed the West. And that's when he decided, to hell with it all. I'm going for it, as you just said. Mm-hmm. And that's when he did something that we made illegal after World War II. In many ways, we fought World War II over it, and that was annexation, right? That's when he annexed Crimea. And, if you had a top 10 commandments of international behavior, at the top would be, thou shalt not start a nuclear war. Let's put that at the top. But maybe number two would be, thou shalt not annex the territory of thy neighbors, right? I mean, that's just taboo. We don't do that after 1939, when Hitler took part of Poland and the Soviet Union took the other. I mean, that's why we went to war. And yet he did it. And to your point, he got away with it, relatively speaking. Mm-hmm. And then he intervened to prop up a dictator in Syria, big military intervention in the Middle East. Russia hadn't done that for decades. Then he intervened in our sovereignty, violated our sovereignty in 2016. That was pretty audacious. Then he went after Mr. Skripal. By the way, somebody I helped to get out of a Russian jail back in 2010 when I was in the government.
This is the unfortunate chap who got poisoned in London.
right. Salisbury, to be exact.
UK. Yeah, that's
Think
right.
about that. Like you went into a NATO country and tried to kill somebody in our country, in one of our allies. So I would agree with you. And it's now been alleged that he has put bounties for our soldiers in Afghanistan, and then Solar Winds, which just happened recently, massive intervention in the cyber world, in our government and our companies. So he's acting pretty out there, I would say. And I hope that the Biden administration will figure out better ways to push back on that.
Let's look at some of those. Solar Winds, the cyber attack. When word first came out, it was shocking enough that it was in dozens or scores of agencies and corporations, and now it looks like it could be in many orders of magnitude larger than that, and at a depth with a kind of penetration of American corporate computer networks and government networks and military networks. That's way beyond the first reports even.
Yes.
Do you see Biden sort of winding up for a response to that, a sort of a tit for tat? How will a Biden administration, I want to look at a number of ways they may respond, but just on the computer front, on the cyber war front, what do you anticipate? What are their options?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First, so we now know about Solar Winds because a private company was involved. As somebody who used to work in government and read a lot of classified information, especially about Russia, when I saw that, I wondered how many other breaches are going on that we haven't been informed about. There's a dark, deep cyber world that is hidden from the American people because it's all done in a classified setting.
But it's not marginal. The cyber world underlies almost everything we do these days.
Correct. And way back when I still worked at the National Security Council years ago, if you were to ask me the things that kept me up at night, it was this world and their tremendous capacity. There's basically three superpowers in this world. It's the United States, Russia, and China. Russia's significantly ahead. They're really, really good at this stuff. And this is a legacy from the Soviet Union, by the way. They used to produce more PhDs in math and physics than anybody, and Putin is invested in this. And so the scale of the problem, I think, is much greater than we probably know, number one. And number two, therefore, I actually think it's bigger conceptually. And let me try to take a stab at this. Because we can't see it, we don't know. I mean, Tom, the Russians could be with us right now. I'm a person that's been targeted by the Russians my whole life, and I still am, by the way. And it's scary when an actor that powerful suddenly appears in your Gmail, as happened for me from time to time. There's nothing more frightening because they have these capabilities. But here's the problem: we don't see it, right? So we don't think it's a threat, and so we treat it as a private affair. We all have our cybersecurity programs on our computers, right?
Yes, we do, but we also know that's la la land. We know that if you have enough of the hand inside our cyber glove, the country can be brought to its knees or to the brink of civil war.
Well, that I hope we all know that it's la la land, but we treat it as if it's not, and that's what I wanted to get.
It's hard to live otherwise. It's hard to live.
Yeah, well, it's hard to live.
Oh my God.
But if you think about, the folks over at CISA, the folks that were in charge of the cybersecurity for Homeland Security, just look at their budget, and then look at the Pentagon's budget for offensive conventional war, orders of magnitude different. Which is to say that, we build aircraft carriers and tanks and missiles and ICBMs and, modernizing our nuclear weapons, because those are physical things and soldiers we can count. And I just think conceptually, we haven't got our heads around that the cyber world is probably the most active war space we're going to have in the next several years. And so we got to treat it that way. So here's what I say when I talk about this with my students. If a bunch of Chinese battleships started to sail into the San Francisco Bay here, you know that the US government would respond to that, right? And we would
Sure.
expect them to defend us, right?
Mhm.
If somebody breaks into my house here, at Stanford, who do I call? I call 911. The government is supposed to protect me and my property from outside intruders. When I have an IT problem, when I have a cyber problem, well, who do I call? I call the IT guy. That's wrong. You know, that conceptually is wrong. The US government has to play a much more bigger role in what I call resilience, of protecting the cyber world, just like they protect the physical world. And we're not there. The government is not doing that right now.
I mean, you've got this new book out, the Wired magazine is serializing, from Admiral Jim Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman, I think, about World War 2034 or something like that. And it describes US battleships and US fighter jets being just taken over in effect, or shut down by, in that case, Chinese cyber war. But this is what's out there.
Yes.
So, but here we are. They have all that capacity. They're inside our government computers right now. We know that from the SolarWinds scandal attack. What are the Biden administration's alternatives there? And I guess we should look more broadly. I mean, here's Timothy asking us online: should we contain Putin, or, and this is the question that gets your trolls all riled up, or encourage revolution in Russia? Right.
That was from Timothy, you said, right, Tom?
Yes.
Well, first, Timothy, I just published a piece in Foreign Affairs recently where I used the word containment very deliberately. And the first subheading is containment at home. So what we're talking about right now, Tom, is containment, deterrence, resilience. That's what we need to do first to contain Putin's Russia.
You mean buff up our own game, get our own house in order as a response to
all
Putin's
those dimensions, right? Our
Yep.
democracy, our cybersecurity, our resilience, and then our resilience within NATO. That's what we do first. And we don't engage with anybody to do that. That's what we do amongst ourselves. And by the way, in the cyber world, and you know, I see signs that the Biden team want to do this. We should do this all together with the democracies of the world, right? And we're better off cooperating on this in terms of a united front. Then I do not think we should try. Some people disagree with me. I don't think we should be in the business of trying to foment revolution in Russia. I think that kind of plays into Putin's hands. And, you know, I know all the Democratic opposition figures in Russia. Some of them I've known for a long time. I know Mr. Navalny, for instance. If they were on this call with us right now, they would say, we don't need your help. This is our fight, but here's what we want you, here's how you can help us. Don't help the autocrats. So they don't want some money or the CIA to help the Democrats. And here I'm speaking about Belarus, I'm speaking about China, Russia, Iran. They're just saying, stop propping up the autocrats through your engagement, through your investment. And I think that's, that's wisdom. And then I also believe, and this I know sounds a bit counterintuitive, that we also have to engage with our competitors, our enemies, our adversaries, however, whatever word you want to use, in narrow spheres to do things that are in our national interests and their national interests, just like we did in the Cold War.
The New START agreement in the last couple of days?
Exactly.
Re-upping that for another 5 years with caps on nuclear weapons?
Right, exactly. Like I was part of the team that negotiated that treaty. One of the greatest achievements of our first couple of years in the Obama team, right? Reducing by 30% the number of nuclear weapons in the world. And most importantly, a very comprehensive inspections regime so that we have, the ability to know what Russia's doing in terms of nuclear modernization, and they have that ability to know what we're doing. That's good. That is stabilizing. Information transfer is stabilizing. And I also think in the long run, cyber might be one of those other areas where we sit down and we say certain elements of this infrastructure need to be off limits. Otherwise, we'll be in a mutual assured destruction world. By the way, not unlike the evolution of nuclear technology and then nuclear doctrine, right? It reminds me a lot of that.
Like and unlike, it seems to me that cybersecurity is even more difficult to document,
Correct.
which makes it even less likely that people will agree to a no-go zone, because they'll never trust that the other party is really respecting that agreement, because it's so subtle and hard to detect.
It's hard. It's very hard. But I would remind you that that's exactly what they said about nuclear weapons back in the 50s and 60s. Like, how can we ever have a verification of the need? Back then, it was the SALT I and SALT II treaties.
Yeah.
They said exactly the same. And eventually, we got more creative about how to do that. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm just a consumer of this knowledge about cyber. But we should not assume that where technology is today is where it will be in terms of tracking this, 5 and 10 years down the road. It's moving in a pretty rapid way.
Tough one though, because every technological advance makes it easier to monitor things, but also makes it easier to evade. Who knows where that's going?
Correct. And Tom, by the way, offense always has the advantage on that. Yeah, offense always has the advantage. Not defense is always much harder.
Well, my civilian perspective makes it look as though Russia is more on the offense than the United States, and maybe China is too, but I don't know if that's true. Are we quietly on the offense against Russia and China? Who's on the offense?
Well, that's another good point, because you mentioned earlier that I have this view that I've been writing about lately, that I think we kind of fell asleep about Russian power, right? We have this image from when the Soviet Union collapsed and the grandmothers selling their pieces of fish. And that's, I think, a common, I travel a lot around the country. I had a book come out a couple of years ago, so I got to speak to a lot of Americans all over the place that went to 30 states. And that's the image that they're left with. That Russia doesn't exist anymore. And on military power, cyber power, conventional military, even economic power, they've recovered. That's number one. And number two, though, Putin is willing to use his power. He's reckless. He's got a high tolerance for risk that we don't, frankly. And that I think creates strategic challenges. Now, you also raised something very important. You and I don't know what we're doing in the cyber world against our enemies. We don't know. Because that's the nature of those kind of weapons, right? Putin's not going to hold a press conference. If a SolarWinds-like attack happens inside the Russian government, you can be assured that there's not going to be a press conference talking about it in Russia, because it's a different it's an autocracy, it's a dictatorship. But I want to be clear, I don't know if it is or isn't happening. It's outside of my view right now.
I want to talk more, of course, about Navalny before we wrap up here, but can we go back for a moment? You said that Navalny, or Democrats like him in Russia, would say, please don't interfere, we'll do our own thing, but don't help the autocrats. That's not as passive or as small a thing as it might sound.
Yes.
I mean, describe all the ways in which structurally, economically, in terms of energy flows, you name it, there's a lot of help to the autocrats, I suppose, going on right now if you're Navalny. And if we really withdrew that, wouldn't that look like an attack by Putin? What would that look like if we really didn't help the autocrats?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a hard question, because we have multiple interests, right? And we're not a dictatorship, by the way. We can't control everything that Americans do and American companies do. But I would say this. I mean, first of all, it's reminding me, it was Boris Nemtsov that said that to Barack Obama when Boris Nemtsov was an opposition leader, tragically killed in 2015. I have this great photo when we met with them in 2009, when he said that very dramatically to Obama. And now Navalny and his team say the same thing. In fact, they put a challenge out. Right before he went back, to remind everybody, Alexei Navalny is an opposition leader, poisoned with Novichok, almost died on the tarmac in a Siberian city, was flown out, recovered in Germany.
Put poison in the elastic of his underwear or something. That was really brutal stuff.
It was brutal stuff, and they wanted to kill him. if not for the heroic efforts of the pilot that landed him and the doctors that took care of him, and then the folks that got him out of the country, he would have died.
Germany flew him into a German hospital.
Yes, and a Russian foundation helped to make that happen too, collaboratively. I mention all that because there's a tendency sometimes in America to treat Russia and Russians as all the same, and they all love Putin, and that video that you and I were just talking about, like that represents all Russia. Please remember that it was that courageous pilot who decided to turn the plane around and land it to save Navalny's life. He's Russian. The emergency team that met him on the tarmac, they're Russians. Navalny, he's Russian. Yulia Navalnaya, his wife that really did heroic work to get him out, she's Russian too. So remember, there's a much more complex society there. But to fast forward, when he, right as he got on the plane to come back to Russia, knowing full well that he would be arrested and he's in custody as we speak, his office, his operation put out a list of Russian business, they would like to be called businessmen. Others call them oligarchs. By the way, there are many people I know personally from my time working as ambassador. He put out a challenge to the Western world. He said, if you want to punish Putin and his regime for the poisoning of me, sanction these people, not these low-level colonels from the
intelligence agencies.
Intelligence agency, that's easy. Like, they don't have any assets in the West. And they published the list. And that's what they meant by, you don't need to help us directly, but you need to not keep helping these people. And in other dimensions, right? We rightly spend a lot of time talking about Chinese surveillance companies inside China. And we've read a lot about that and how they're exporting this technology. Well, guess what? There's a lot of American companies exporting the same technologies to countries like Belarus. And
help them keep track of their populations, help autocrats stay in power.
Yes. And I've been working with some Belarusians on this recently, and their challenge to me, they're saying to us, if you're serious about wanting to help democracy, why are you allowing these American companies to export this technology to this dictator that suppresses us?
Michael, take us in a little bit to the Navalny story here. I mean, we saw what he survived, or we read about it. It's unbelievable. But he did survive and kept working and now he's gone back. I mean, James writes to us here, says, Navalny's courage is insane, a true badass. You know him. What motivates him? What gives him the courage? Is it just insane, simple courage? What gives him the rational structure for walking back into that country, knowing he'll go straight to jail? Is it a suicide mission? Is there something that gives him confidence that he'll walk back out of that jail? They just tried to call. I was in Germany when they poisoned him, and all of Europe was immediately just aghast. What gives him confidence they won't do that again? What drives him? Where does Navalny's hope come from? What's the vision he has of how things might turn out here that makes it worthwhile? I think his wife is in jail now too, maybe even his brother, and lots of his associates. What moves him? Well,
I've had the privilege over the last several decades to meet on rare occasion people like Navalny. And a lot of them you've never heard of because a lot of them were killed or rotted in jail and did not lead the revolution in various countries. And I think that's a sober thing to remember. We know the Valensas and the Havels and the Mandelas of the world. We don't know about, Akbar Ganji, that probably nobody's ever heard of, that spent many years in jail in Iran. And then, things didn't work out after he got released. And now I think he's living in exile in Canada. And I could go through that list. What they have in common, and there's a lot of debate in the West about is he a nationalist or not. And, my view of that is let the Russian people decide on these policy issues. Wouldn't it be nice if they could have a free and fair election and decide for themselves? Like, let's stop being so judgmental and say this high horse that we get on sitting from Palo Alto, judging whether this man is virtuous or not. I believe fundamentally, having known him and read him and know the people around him, that on the same debate we were having earlier about Trumpism, yes, there's liberals and conservatives, and there are many things Navalny has said that I radically disagree with personally, right, in terms of policy. But on the
Mike, could you name a couple? Because in the Western press, he's just kind of Saint Navalny, and you don't hear more than that. What's the complexion?
He said some things about minorities in Russia, for instance, that I disagree with. At one point, in his career, I think he was, relations with Ukraine. I would say he has a different view than I do about that relationship.
Okay. So it's not like descended from heaven in a pure cloud of I don't know what sainthood. He's complex, but still he's
as all of these leaders that I just mentioned were too. I mean, I want to remind your listeners of that we all think of Nelson Mandela in these godlike structures, right? And I think people should remember Nelson Mandela was the head of the armed wing of the ANC. He believed in violence. He believed that was a struggle, and the ANC was allied with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and they were Stalinists at the time. So,
and George Washington wore the teeth of slaves.
So. Exactly. So it's just too easy to play that gotcha game and find something from the past. My own view of his ideology is he's evolved, and he's not the same today as he was, before. But that is not the important thing. The important thing is that there's a divide between autocrats and Democrats in Russia, just like we were talking in America. And in that divide, it's clear as day that he's for democracy, and he's for the peaceful struggle for democracy. And that's why, in my view, that puts him on the list with those other leaders we were talking about. As to his courage, what I would say is this is his fate. People say, why did he choose to go back? He would answer that question. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but, he would say, what are you talking about? There was no choice. This is my country. I'm not going to allow these people to chase me out. And he has braced himself to live with the fact that he may spend many years of his life in jail for these ideals. And he is a badass, by the way, Tom. That is a good answer for him, because not only has he been fighting this regime the way he has and poisoned and shipped out, but then he called up and he had a conversation with one of the people that poisoned him and got him to confess that happened.
Amazing.
And then right before he went in, he released this incredible video that now 100 million people have seen, exposing this. It's called Putin's Palace. Those are
amazing video. Listeners, viewers, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's on YouTube. It has English subtitles, and it is really compelling. Describe it, Michael. There's this ginormous palace, I guess, on the Black Sea, that he says, this is Putin's. This is your money, Russians. Is this what you want? And it's just one symbol of deep, multi-billion-dollar corruption around Putin.
Well, you just described it well. That's what it is. It's this over-the-top palace that would even be audacious for Tsarist times. And, the thing that Navalny and his team does, and I encourage people to look at it, it's 2 hours long because they meticulously document, the evidence to support the case for exposing this. But that he released it right as he was flying in. And it was interesting. I watched Putin's reaction to it. I speak Russian, and
there was a clip where it seemed like a school kid asked Putin in some forum, "Hey, what about it? Is that your palace? What's going on here?"
And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but so if I get it wrong, correct me on Twitter or something. But he said, I've never owned that, nor have my close relatives. And that word close, bliski na russkом языке, that was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I thought, you don't say close relatives unless you have in mind some other ones. And Navalny documented it wasn't a close relative. It was a distant relative that they allege in the documentary is the kind of nominal owner of that palace.
So there he is. He's in jail. We saw last weekend amazing numbers of Russians out in the streets all over the country, including where, I don't know where it was, Irkutsk or somewhere, it would look like, I think it was 50 below. What is bringing those people out of Italy? What's their expectation of what they might achieve with this? And what is Navalny's vision? If he somehow, and it's hard to picture how it happens, maybe you could describe a potential scenario, emerges successful in his campaign for democracy in Russia. What do the people in the streets think? Who are they? What do they envision? And what does Navalny envision?
Yeah, great questions. And I only have partial answers to them. First, about the people that protested. If you look at the demographics of who are pro-democracy and pro-Navalny backers, the more educated you are, the more urban you are, the richer you are, and the younger you are, the more likely you are to support Navalny. And the opposite is true for Putin. So the more rural you are, the less educated you are, the less wealthy you are, and the older you are, you're more likely to support Putin, right? So that's the kind of
point. This sounds like the American Trump, not Trump divide.
Exactly.
To a point.
It's exactly the same divide. Straight up, exactly the same demographics. But having said that, Navalny over the years, especially in the last couple of years, has taken more of a social democratic turn, I would say, in his views to try to expand his supporters beyond the demographic that I just described. And
you mean to say to the common man, quote unquote, in Russia and woman, a Navalny administration, hard to imagine, but if there were one, it would do things for you. Right.
And his main message, including with that video that we were just talking about, is here's what they're doing with your money, folks. You know, to the workers out there, the people struggling on pensions, this regime is taking your money and building these outrageous palaces. And, you know, the economy hasn't been growing and wages haven't been growing. And we need to redistribute our money, right? So that's part of the message he's trying to develop. But a couple of things I think are important to add to the layers to this. First of all, there has been some survey work of the demonstrators last weekend. 25% report that they're first-time demonstrators. That's new. That's pretty surprising. And then the other thing to remember, again, as a student of these kinds of movements, I teach a course on social movements here at Stanford. These demonstrations were illegal. People knew that they faced the prospect of being arrested. By the way, 3,000 of them were arrested. That suggests to me that if tens of thousands go out knowing that they're going to be arrested, and add to that, Tom, the point you made, it was really cold in a lot of those cities. That means that hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, share their same preferences, but don't want to go and be beaten up by the Russian police and be arrested. Yeah. And that, I think, is something everybody needs to remember. There's a whole academic literature on this called preference falsification, where, you know, in autocracies, you keep your preferences to yourself. You don't go out and explore them. But that suggests that, you know, and other survey work shows that Putin is falling. I mean, he's at the lowest public support he's been at since becoming president right now. And the last thing I'll say on this, to your point of scenarios, I don't know. And I don't believe anybody that does know. We in political science, we're not very good at predicting the fall of regimes. By the way, I was in the government. I would say CIA is not very good at it either.
But just give us not a prediction, but I think it's hard for a lot of people. I mean, there's simultaneously right now this sense that, whoa, maybe Putin is peaking out. Maybe he's topping out. On the other hand, you look around and illiberal governments are flourishing everywhere, and we're still over a barrel in this country. Maybe he's not. What is even a scenario in which a Navalny figure can succeed in that Russian structure today?
I don't know. And I want to be humble about even scenarios. But so with the caveat that I don't know, and I don't really trust anybody that says they know, you know, my prediction is that Putin's regime will stay in power as long as Putin is president. It's hard for me to imagine a scenario where he falls, as like we saw in the Arab Spring or we saw in 1989.
Mm-hmm.
The regime is just too strong. It's too penetrated. He's a very capable autocrat. I would say that, but it's very hard for me to believe that regime lasts much longer after Putin is incapacitated or no longer in power.
He looks fairly healthy.
he works out a lot. He could be around for a long time. But because he hasn't built a political party, there's not a successor there. And I do think there's just this malaise, right? I mean, he's been around forever. And I say this when talking about it with others, like I worked for President Obama, for 5 years, honor of a lifetime. Whatever your politics, I found him to be a very virtuous leader, and it was an honor of a lifetime to work for him. And I even said this to him one time, I think I would even get tired of him being president for 21 years. You kind of get tired of people, and
the moves become too familiar.
Yeah, and I think that is happening in Russia, and I think it could actually unravel pretty quickly after Putin.
After Putin could be a long time.
Correct.
A couple of things. One, the race factor here. In Russia today, somehow, subtle voice, Putin seems to give encouragement to white supremacists. Is it because he's one himself? Is it just because they imagine that an American autocracy would advantage them? And so that's how does race, and Russia, as you say, has been very willing to go at the racial divides in America to keep this country divided and against itself. How does Putin play the race card globally, at home? How does race factor into the age of Putinism?
Yeah, it's a hard, complex question. I'm actually writing about it right now. But let me say a couple of things. Number one, Putin has used nationalist rhetoric in ethnically laced ways. And remember, he came to power back in 1999 by fighting against the Chechens that, allegedly did these terrorist attacks. There's a lot of, buzz about whether they were concocted staged. I don't know the truth to that, but that's the way he rose in power. And he said some very racist things about them. We're going to wipe them out when they're sitting in their outhouse toilets. I mean, in Russian, it has this very ethnically tinged way to talk about it. Mm-hmm. He's then pumped the brakes a little bit on that over the decades because, 20% of the Russian population are Muslim, and he's got to be careful with that. Mm-hmm. And he has now cultivated some Muslim leaders, including in Chechnya, in this very difficult space. But there's an ethnic dimension there. There's an anti-Semitic dimension there, by the way. When you use the word oligarchs and we use the word oligarch, we don't think that is a code word for Jewish. But when you're in Russia, oftentimes there is a subtle hinting because a lot of the original business people in the 1990s were of Jewish descent. And so he plays on that card too. And people around him, he's too careful to do it, but he cultivates these people around him. He gives them platforms. He allows them to develop that are, outright racist and nationalist, white supremacists. And those are the people that have these transatlantic ties with other people like them in Europe and here in the United States.
I'm going to let you go in a second, but tell us this. Are we one day, when somehow everything comes out, are we going to learn about all kinds of Russian interference and financial relations and more with the Trump family, the Trump squad that we never knew about? Is there a continent of things still to be learned there that we don't know?
Again, I don't know the answer, right? Because I haven't seen it, but I'll tell you what was very surprising to me in the Mueller report. Given the people he hired for his investigation on the financial side, and given little bits and pieces that we've seen in the news about various financial transactions and, apartments sold for twice their value in Florida to Russian business people, I expected that there was going to be a big chunk of that report about these financial ties, and it was absent. And what I don't know, there's three explanations for that. One is there's nothing there. Two is that they did that and they kept it classified. Or three, that they were moving down that road and they got shut down and they were said, this is getting enough is enough. It kind of ended, as you recall, it kind of ended sputtered out, surprisingly. And I don't know the answer to that. I do know, having studied Russia for a long time and having worked in the US government, when I had access to classified information, that Putin uses money at home and abroad to create leverage all the time. That is his main instrument. That's how he rules Russia. All these oligarchs, right? We've been talking about. Why is it stable? It's stable because Putin gave them money, and in return, they give him loyalty, and then they build palaces for him, like Navalny discovered, right? That's this weird, symbiotic, coercive relationship that you get to keep your property rights, but I know that you stole them. And so I'm going to keep that compromise on you to keep you loyal to me. That's the way he rules Russia. And that's the way he has cultivated relationships around the world, particularly in parts of Europe. So it'd be surprising to me that he hasn't tried to do that here in the United States. But I want to be clear, I don't know the empirical evidence there. Someday I suspect we'll learn it, but we haven't learned it yet.
Let's go out on some dark and some light. Dark because you got to be real. Here's a listener, Vitaly. He says the main reason Putin gets reelected, and there's another election in 2024, right? Is because there's no alternative in Russians' eyes. Navalny emerges as a real alternative, and so I predict he will get murdered soon. Let us pray not. There's a dark thought, and I wonder your thoughts on it. And then the light, if you'll share it. I mean, you've walked through a lot and had plenty of personal attacks on you as you've spoken up about Russia and democracy and autocracy over time. What's the place you go to in the back of your mind for hope and hope as you consider it? But what about Vitaly's fear and what's the source of your hope?
Okay, great, very hard questions. I mean, Vitaly's actually absolutely right. It's hard for Russians to imagine alternative because they've never had one. And this reminds me of something Obama, I used to drive Obama nuts in his briefing papers. We would show him how much we thought Putin was worth, by the way, and his popularity. Obama's a very competitive guy. I've actually played basketball with him. He does not like to lose.
You wanted to be as rich as Putin?
Well, but the popularity piece really would get under his craw, because there were some times when early on, by the way, in 2010, Obama was more popular in Russia than he was in our country for a while. But his competitive juices would get going on that, because he would look at that and he'd say, yeah, but Putin controls all the television stations. He controls the Congress. He controls all the rich people, all civil society. If I had all that control, I'd be at 90% too. That's no great achievement.
Okay.
And defeating, non-competitors. I mean, we would put it in basketball terms. It's like the Lakers going out and playing my son's high school basketball team. That's not real competition. That's ridiculous. And Vitaly is right that he has now emerged without question as the only viable opposition. And he's still, not well known compared to Putin, let's be clear. And that makes him very risky. That means that's why he's in jail. And I fear that he could be in jail for a long time because of what Vitaly just said. If I'm speaking honestly, that's a fear I have for Mr. Navalny. On the light, I mean, for me, as somebody who believes in democracy, and, in a way, it's kind of been my life's cause, both as an academic, but also to try to support it. And, these years have been hard. I've been taking incoming from Russian trolls first, and then from Trump supporters, and they say nasty things to me. And Tom, they've threatened my life many times in ways that are scary. I don't want to trivialize it at all. And in this hyper-connected world, I'm a public figure. It's really easy to find out who I am and who my family is. And
Sure.
it's that has not been easy. It's been a difficult road. What gives me hope, first in America, is, like I said, we have democratic institutions that give us the possibility for renewal. And I see that possibility now. It was a great, moment when the forces of democracy won out over the forces of autocracy, first in the election in my mind, but then even after that dark day on January 6th, despite the lack of courage of some, I did see some courageous individuals, including in the Republican Party, and that gives me hope that we are in a period. I don't know the predictions, but I see people thinking about democratic renewal in America, including the President of the United States. That gives me hope. More broadly speaking, I would say this, that there are just so many people. I mean, we focused on Navalny today, but we could be talking about Belarusians or Chinese or Iranians as well. Just got an email from a very brave human rights activist in Vietnam just 2 days ago. And what gives me hope is their courage. And from my comfort, like my very comfortable life as a professor at Stanford, and yet I'm interacting. I have the incredible privilege of interacting with truly heroic figures. You can't interact with them and not feel hopeful. And Obama had weaved into his carpet a phrase, and I'm going to paraphrase it now, and he stole it from Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King stole it from somebody else. So, there's no footnotes in this stuff, but, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I take faith in that, but I also add to it, it only bends when people make it bend. I strongly believe that actors in the world matter. It's not just these structural socioeconomic forces. And that's what gives me hope. And that they're the people that inspire me. And I feel an obligation to help them. But it's not, I don't want to make it sound altruistic. It is, there's nothing better than feeling like you are helping the good people in the world. There is good and evil in the world. There is. And when you are doing something on the side of good, first you have to know what side of the fence you're on, right? You got to figure that out. And once you figure that out, then to do something to help the side of good is not just altruism. It makes me feel better. It gives me energy. It gives me, it makes me more optimistic. And I feel very privileged that in my life, I get to interact with those kind of people.
Michael McFaul, Montana boy, now very much a world figure in a way, and putting your shoulder to that arc, to that wheel of history in a way that we can all see. Respect for you taking that incoming and the difficulty that comes with that and sticking with it. This only works when people like you and lots of others raise their voices and their perspective and make it known with courage. It's a time for courage right now. We're grateful for all of that. And we'll be supporting you as you stick with it and feel very confident that you will. Thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts with us today, your perspective and insight with us today. It's really been great.
Tom, those are very kind words. I really appreciate it. Great to be on with you.
Hang right in there. We'll check in again before long.
All right, sounds good.
Michael.
All right, thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Take it easy. Not too easy though. We need you.
Okay.
We need you slugging out there. Okay, now we do our tech stuff here. All right, thanks, Michael. Thank you everybody for joining us. What a great American public figure with global influence. And we're thinking on Navalny right now. More demonstrations slated for this weekend in Russia. Keep your eyes on those. And it's called Putin's Palace, the documentary made by Navalny's crew. It's on YouTube right now. I really encourage you to check it out. See you again soon. We're going to be talking next week about COVID. We're going to be talking with astronaut Jessica Meyer, who spent a lot of time up on the International Space Station, about the world beyond that Elon Musk and a whole lot of others are targeting right now, and her sense of where humans go in space. See you next week. Thanks for being with us.